Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Christmas Fire. Author's notes. The following narrative is based on actual events that took place in West Virginia near the close of the Second World War. As many facts as possible have been maintained from the reality, though some details, such as names, have necessarily been altered to fit this story. A few very minor points have been added to fill out the conversation. Some facts which would not alter the outcome have been omitted for brevity. Additionally, it is the author's feeling that, as a medical doctor, John Watson would have had more to contribute to criminal cases than is stated in the original stories. Perhaps the good doctor was simply being modest in his accounts. At any rate, he has intentionally been given a somewhat less passive role in this tale. I deliberated long on whether I shouldn't publish this account among the cases of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, as it involves the worst misfortune that can befall loving parents, and has pulled at the heartstrings of a pair of such these many years. It was also published throughout the country and beyond at the time, owing to its elements of compelling tragedy and baffling mystery, and I did not wish to add to their misery by bringing up the matter afresh. I was not deterred by the fact that Mr. Holmes was unable to bring the case to a satisfactory conclusion, as my reasons for making my accounts of his work are dedicated more to the displays of his prodigious skills than to the ultimate results. In the end, after a conversation with the mother spoken of herein, I was not only given her blessing to proceed, but indeed was pressed by her to do so in hopes that the attention might bring unknown information to light. I therefore offer the following. It began, as had many other of our adventures, as Holmes and I were in our rooms at 221B Baker Street. On a grey afternoon in April, I sat in the easy chair by the window, attempting to tackle a stack of the latest medical journals, while Holmes was at his files, reorganizing them after his records of some recent cases had piled up, when we heard a familiar step rush up the stairs. "That will be Inspector Gregson," said Holmes, confirming my own thoughts. In a moment came the knock at the door. "Come in, Inspector," called my companion. The good inspector entered, wiping his brow. "Mr. Holmes," he began in a rush of excitement, hurrying into the room, "I'm in need of your help. I'm up against the most foggy case of my career. Indeed, I can't conceive of a foggier." "Well then, please do sit down and tell us about it," Holmes offered. "And please remember not to be sparing with the details." Both men sat down and I set my stack of journals aside. As always, nothing within them could offer as much interest as a matter that was brought before Sherlock Holmes. "Are you familiar with the Mulaski case?" Gregson asked. "The burnt-down house and the missing or dead children?" "The very same," Gregson affirmed. "So you have heard of it?" "I hardly think there is a hearing or literate person in the Empire who hasn't," said Holmes. "And when I knew that it was you who had come, I suspected it was the reason, as I had read that you were working on it, and I hadn't heard of its resolution." "You are correct," the inspector said with pride, though it was tinged with some weariness. "When the chief constable asked for our help, I asked to be assigned, as I felt in my gut that this was not a simple case of children perishing in a house fire." "Yes, I recall that it was you who stepped forward to agree with the parents on that point," said Holmes. "One of your strengths, Gregson, is that you follow your gut. What you often lack is the ability to piece together the evidence to prove your gut correct. I am not certain I'm in possession of all of the facts, so why don't you give them to us?" Gregson took out his notebook and read from it. "The Mulaski family consists of the father, Simon, his wife, Agatha, and 9 children, aged 3 to 23. You may remember that their home was on a farm outside Kingston upon Hull. On Christmas Eve last, Simon and the 2 older boys had gone to bed by 10 o'clock. The 3 younger daughters, other than the very youngest, were playing with some Christmas presents from their oldest sister, Anna. 2 of the adolescent boys, Andre and Jacob, had been asked to finish the farm chores before going to bed. Agatha took the youngest, Sophia, upstairs with her. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the telephone rang, and Agatha went down to the parlor to answer. She states that the caller was a woman whom she did not know, and that she asked for the name of someone whom Agatha also did not know. Agatha told her that she had reached a wrong telephone number, and said that this was met with a weird laugh. She also observed that it sounded as though a party of some kind was going on in the room the caller was in, or nearby, which is not surprising due to the holiday. She says that the lamps in the parlor were still on, and the curtains had not been drawn, and the doors were unlocked, all of which was unusual, as whoever was the last to retire normally turned off the lamps and drew the curtains before going to bed. Also, the candles on the Christmas tree had not been put out. Despite the fact that she saw that Anna had fallen asleep on the sofa, she found this state of things to be odd, and tended to them herself before returning to bed. Later on, about 1 a.m., Agatha was awakened by a sound, as of something hitting the roof of the home and rolling down it. Hearing nothing more for several minutes, she went back to sleep. It was only about half an hour later that she awoke again, this time to the smell of smoke. She rose to find the source of it, finding a fire on the stairs leading to the attic. She roused Mr. Mulaski, and he went and awoke his oldest 2 sons. These 4, plus the eldest and youngest daughters, escaped the home. However, as you may recall, the remaining 5 children did not make it out of the house with them. Before leaving, the others tried to call to them. They were unable to go upstairs to the attic as the stairway leading to it from the first floor was already engulfed in flames. Interestingly, when the constable interviewed him, the eldest son, Anthony, stated that he had gone upstairs and awakened the children. However, when I questioned him, he told me that he had only ever called up to them, but had not actually seen them. This is where things take an even stranger turn, Mr. Holmes. Gregson had evidently taken extensive notes, as he not only spent a lot of time looking at his notebook, but he was turning pages rather infrequently. They could not use their own telephone to call for help, finding that the room that Mr. Mulaski used as his office was on fire around the telephone line, and there was a jet of flame issuing from the room's gas line. So Anna had to run to a neighbor's house to use theirs. Another neighbor had seen the fire and tried to call the fire brigade from a nearby pub, but he was unable to reach the operator. He therefore went into Hull and was successful in contacting the fire brigade. Meanwhile, Mr. Mulaski and his sons continued to try and get to the children through a window. At first, Mr. Mulaski attempted to climb the exterior walls to the attic, but in the act of breaking a window, he cut his arm. They normally had a ladder resting against the outside of the house, which they hoped to be able to use, but were unable to locate it. Incidentally, I later found it at the bottom of an embankment some 75 feet away from the home. Mr. Mulaski has 2 carriages in his barn, which he uses for his business. Fearing they didn't have time to hitch up the horses, he and the boys attempted to push the carriages up to the house in hopes of climbing upon them to get to the window, but they were unable to move them, even though there had been no problem with them only the day before. They said the wheels were stuck, but no cause was ever found. At some point after the fire, but before I began my investigation, attempts were made to move them again, this time with success. The fire brigade were not able to arrive in time to be of any help, owing to the difficulty of assembling at such a time of night. Other than much of the stonework, the house had entirely burnt to the ground by the time they arrived. These, Mr. Holmes, are the facts of the fire. Was the cause of the fire ever determined? Asked Holmes. No, but the chief of the fire brigade, a Mr. Morris, surmised that it was due to a fault in one of the gas lamps, which of course is not uncommon. Holmes settled further into his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him and placing his fingertips together in front of his face. What can you tell me of the family? Asked Holmes. Had they any enemies? Quite a few, I'm afraid. Both Mr. and Mrs. Mulaski were born in Poland, but emigrated here separately. They met and married in Hull, and all of their children were born there. Over the past 20 or 30 years or so, Poland has been divided and redivided by external powers, and many Poles, both at home and expatriated, believe that the salvation of their people and their nation lies in their espousing communism. Mr. Mulaski, having many strong opinions, including many against communism, made it clear in no uncertain terms and on many occasions that he does not share this view. This has caused no small amount of animosity towards him amongst his neighbors, for, you see, Hull has a sizable enclave of Poles. Many accused him of being a traitor. One man, a visiting life insurance salesman, told Mr. Mulaski that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Quite an incriminating threat, observed Holmes. I hope you have found the man and questioned him. I have indeed, and, well, he states that not only was he simply angry about Mr. Mulaski's views, he also was feeling rather desperate to sell a policy, hence the threat on the children's lives. Also, after the night in question, there were some passers-by who stated that they saw some people throwing fireballs at the roof of the house around 1 a.m., which, you will remember, was about the time that Mrs. Mulaski said she heard something hit the roof. Uttered Holmes. What else? Well, interestingly, the eldest son does not share his father's opinions of communism. His are more in line with those of the majority of Mr. Mulaski's countrymen. Also, the Mulaskis tell me that he presses them to accept the fact that the children are gone and to stop chasing ghosts, etc., and continue on with their lives. Have you any other information that might be of help? Asked Holmes. I have, stated Gregson, reaching into his pocket and producing some small items, which he then handed to Holmes. They gleamed almost like ivory in the light from the window as they changed hands. I have just been back to the ruins of the house and found these. Holmes turned them over in his hands. They appear to be bones, said he. Yes, Gregson agreed. Those of a youth or older child, I believe. What of it? Asked Holmes. Could they not belong to one of the children? Inquired Gregson. Dr. Watson, would you have a look? Holmes held them out to me and I took them, eager to be of help in the matter. You say you have been back to the ruins, Holmes said to Gregson as I examined the bones. Yes. How many times had you been there before? Several. I'm so confounded that I'm trying to find more clues any way I can. After finding these, I'd be tempted to think that everyone who says the children didn't make it out of the house was correct. But my feeling that they didn't perish continues. That's why I came to you. How did you come to find these bones? I was again checking through the ruined walls and piles of ash and dirt that mark where the house stood, and I found them after only a minute or so of digging through the debris. I don't know how I missed them before. Did they look just like this? I asked, holding them up. There were some bits stuck to them, but I dusted them off, the inspector replied. Otherwise, yes. What do you make of it, Watson? Asked Holmes. They are specifically bones of the lower spine, I said. What was the age of the eldest child who's missing, Gregson? He consulted his notes once again. 14. I believe these bones are from someone older than that due to some marks of development, I said, shaking my head, though I cannot say absolutely for certain. However, these bones were neither burnt in a fire, nor were they sitting in that pile of debris until you found them. They're too undamaged and clean. Are you certain? Asked Gregson. He is correct, Inspector, interjected Holmes. The bones haven't the signs of having been burnt, and if they had been in the dirt and ash for so long, you would have had to do more than dust them off to get them clean. Moreover, why would these bones only have been found out of so many? Besides, you said yourself that you found them after only a brief search. The fact is, you missed them on your previous visits because they weren't there. Well, both Morris and the Chief Constable admitted that their initial examination of the site was rather cursory. That changes nothing, said Holmes. Someone planted the bones there, and recently. Who would do that? Gregson asked in shock. Someone who wants you to drop the case, said Holmes. Someone who knows you've frequently been searching the ruins and decided to throw your red herring. Had the debris been dug through before? Yes, more than once. And no other bones were found? Asked Holmes. None. It has been proposed that they were burnt to ash as well. I think not, said Holmes dismissively. The flames of a crematorium's furnace are stoked to temperatures much higher than that of a building fire, and for a couple of hours or so, and even then, the bones normally are not destroyed. Gregson looked at me and I nodded in agreement. But, Mr. Holmes, protested Gregson, you make it sound as if it's some great conspiracy. Is that so implausible? Insisted Holmes. They do exist, you know. Well, yes, but there are no indications. Inspector Gregson, in spite of your efforts to emulate my methods, you still fall prey to the Scotland Yard inspector's frequent inability to see the forest for the trees. Mr. Holmes? Gregson didn't seem to grasp my friend's analogy. What I mean is, continued Holmes, suppressing a frustrated sigh, that you are so distracted by the various outre elements of this case that you do not realize that those very elements are the clues that lead to the solution of the same. Do you? Gregson's mind seemed to be reeling and he was almost having trouble speaking. His disbelief caused his voice to rise slightly with almost every syllable. Do you mean to tell me, Mr. Holmes, that you have arrived at the solution to this mystery? Of course, said Holmes calmly. That is to say, I do not know in whose charge the children are currently to be found, or where, but I know exactly who is directly responsible for helping spirit the children away. But how? Gregson's typically calm demeanor was nowhere to be found. It was clear that his mind was filled with questions. Well, first of all, the reason I suspect a conspiracy is because there are, in fact, indications, perhaps not so great a one as you imagine, but it really takes only two people to make a conspiracy, though in this case there are certainly more than that. Will you please catch me up, Mr. Holmes? I just can't make everything fit together. It is not for you to make things fit together, only to see how they already do. Well, yes, we can be absolutely certain that the children were not in the house when it was on fire. Absolutely certain, Mr. Holmes? Yes, said Holmes flatly. Not only have no remains been found, but the children were not heard by the family at any point after the fire started. But they may have fainted from inhaling the smoke. "Watson, is it possible to faint in your sleep from inhaling smoke?" asked Holmes, turning to me. "I sincerely doubt it," I said, chuckling. "As we all know, the smoke needs only reach one's throat before the irritation causes the involuntary reaction of coughing." "Exactly," said Holmes, "and this would rouse the sufferer from sleep." "I cannot imagine a case where it wouldn't," said I, "especially since one would do quite a lot of coughing before losing consciousness, whatever the amount of smoke present. Not only that, but Mrs. Mulaski was awakened by the smell of smoke alone." "Thank you, Watson," said Holmes, turning again to Gregson. "Even if it were possible to faint from smoke in one's sleep, the likelihood that it would have happened to all 5 children simultaneously is rather small. Moreover, the children undoubtedly would have been awakened by the heat if the fire had somehow reached their room before much of the smoke had, and therefore they would not have been unsuspectingly claimed by the fire itself. Furthermore, the arsonists tried to start the fire on the roof, which is the least sensible place to do so. Normally, the arsonist will attempt to start a fire as near the base of the house as possible, since, as we all know, fire burns upward. They did this in hopes that they could destroy any evidence as early as possible that the children were not in the attic. You see, Gregson, as I said, it is absolutely certain that the children were not in the house during the fire." "But how is it possible that they would have been out of the house?" "You have heard me say many times that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. They could only have been inside the house or outside. It is impossible that they were inside, therefore they were outside. Furthermore, it is not so difficult to work out how they got outside." "Isn't it?" asked Gregson, becoming crestfallen at his inability to emulate his mentor. "How did it transpire then?" "I will tell you presently," Holmes assured him. "But first, I should like to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Mulaski. Can that be arranged?" "Certainly," said Gregson eagerly, knowing that the sooner he gave Holmes what he asked for, the sooner my friend would reveal a solution to the mystery. "I've had them put up in the Grosvenor Hotel so that I can easily call on them if needed. Come with me." We grabbed our hats and coats and followed the inspector outside. We walked round the corner and took the underground from Baker Street to Victoria Station, and were at the Grosvenor before long. Gregson led us inside before leaving us in the foyer. Several minutes later, we heard the clear voice of a woman, speaking distinctly in English, but with an accent that seemed to come from the eastern regions of Europe. Gregson brought us into a side room, where we were greeted by the pitiable sight of a man and woman who could only be the Mulaskis, judging by their grief-stricken and careworn faces. My companion handed me his hat and strode to them as Gregson introduced all of us.
"Oh, Mr. Holmes,"
the lady cried, reaching out to him with both hands as he sank to one knee before her.
"Thank you for helping us. Inspector Gregson has told us much about you, and we at last have a ray of hope in darkness."
I have often been amazed that, especially for a man who prizes reason and logic above emotion and sentiment, my friend had a better bedside manner than most doctors I knew. It was on display here. Immediately upon kneeling before Mrs. Mulaski, he had taken her hands in one of his, and then tenderly placed the other over them. "My dear madam," he said, looking her solemnly in the eye, and speaking to her as would a father or caring, protective brother. "I know that you and your husband have suffered a great loss, and that your hearts cry out for anything that will bring your children back to you. I wish to tell you that, while I am doing everything in my power to assist Inspector Gregson, I must frankly confess that I do not think it will be possible to find your children again. It is more than reasonable to believe that they are well hidden, and I do not think that those who have them are prepared to give them up." "Then should we give them up?" Mr. Mulaski interjected with a note of consternation. "Of course not," answered Holmes kindly. "I merely wanted you to understand that there are limits to the assistance I can provide in your case."
"Please tell me, Mr. Holmes,"
said Mrs. Mulaski, her eyes brimming with tears.
"Are my children alive?"
Holmes nodded gravely. "Without a doubt, Mrs. Mulaski, your children still live."
"Oh, Mr. Holmes."
Her utterance came almost as a sob, and the tears rolled down her cheeks. She brought his hands up and kissed them repeatedly in the throes of her gratitude and relief.
"Thank you, Mr. Holmes, thank you. May God bless you, Mr. Holmes."
Holmes nodded humbly. "And you, Mrs. Mulaski." He tightened his grip on her hands reassuringly before standing. Mr. Mulaski stood as well, his own eyes wet with emotion. "Thank you for all of your efforts, Mr. Holmes." He shook my friend's hand. "And Inspector Gregson, and your friend." He firmly shook Gregson's hand and mine in turn. We replaced our hats and doffed them as we bade the Mulaskis a good day. We exited the hotel, pausing on the pavement out in front of the entrance. I had to dab my eyes with my kerchief, and even Inspector Gregson seemed to need to recover himself after the tender scene we had just witnessed. "Mr. Holmes," said he after a few moments, You didn't ask them any questions." "I didn't have any questions for them," said my friend, and I smiled at his graciousness in coming only to comfort the distraught couple. Though I did learn something that confirmed my theory. And what is that? Simply that Mrs. Malersky possesses one of those voices which can be heard across the room, even in a whisper. And what theory of yours did it confirm? We should come to that. But first, I was going to explain the more hidden facts to you. First, we know that the family had enemies. This presents our motive. Are you saying they were trying to kill the family? Not at all, only that they were trying to prevent the parents or police from trying to find them. The plan was to extricate their children and burn the house down to make it seem that they were dead, not missing. To what end? To transfer the children to an environment in which they would be brought up to become more patriotic to the Polish cause, of course. But how did they get the children out of the house in the middle of the night without waking anyone? The attic was above the first floor. They had 2 floors of the house to get down. Yes, it would have required the kidnapper to have an intimate knowledge not only of the house, but where the children were to be found. Not only that, but someone who could keep them quiet. Tell me, Gregson, how does a kidnapper keep 5 children quiet all while moving up and down through a house? I cannot think of anything, unless he rendered them unconscious, but then he would have to carry them. However, it would require multiple trips, and that would take too long and increase the risk of waking the family. That it would, Gregson. But suppose the kidnapper had to neither render them unconscious nor carry them. Indeed, what if he didn't have to force them at all, only to lead them? You are just presenting me with another riddle, Mr. Holmes. I don't see how that would be possible. It would be quite possible if they knew and trusted their kidnapper, and he gave them a compelling reason not only to come with them outside and get into a carriage, but to be silent about it. Perhaps he told them that they and their family were going somewhere else for Christmas, and that he would momentarily return with the rest of the family. But how did this person get into the house? He didn't get into the house, Gregson. He was already in it. What? Hiding? Inspector Gregson, let me put it another way. If this fire were arson, whom could we most strongly suspect of being responsible for it, generally speaking? Well, the finger of suspicion points to those with whom Mr. Malersky disagreed. Precisely. And were all such people to be found outside the Malersky household? A change came over the good inspector's face as the realization dawned on him. Are you saying that the eldest son is behind all this? Perhaps not all of it. I rather suspect that he heard people talk of burning down the house, perhaps to teach Mr. Malersky a lesson, when he hatched the plot to have the children taken away. Or perhaps it was the other way round. In fact, it's entirely possible that the lad was trying to incriminate the life insurance salesman, undoubtedly having heard of the incident from his parents. Either way, it scarcely matters. The lad was unhappy with his father's stance, and he seized the opportunity to have most of his younger siblings relocated to surroundings that would be conducive to their being more reasonable, as I'm sure he would put it. This is the only thing that answers all of the facts, most specifically the silent disappearance of the children within a very short interval, his conflicting accounts of his trying to save them, and of his trying to persuade his parents to cease trying to find them, or even prove that they did not die in the fire, to say nothing of the missing ladder and the stuck carriage wheels. It especially explains how the fire started inside the home, not on the roof. But, as I said, it could easily have been a faulty gas lamp. According to you, Mrs. Malersky stated that the fire was on the stairs. I do not believe that she would have been able to mistake a fire coming from a gas lamp for a fire on the staircase. Again, the attempt was being made to keep anyone in the family from getting upstairs before the fire claimed the attic, or barred their passage. The son's culpability also explains why the lights were still on and the door was unlocked when Mrs. Malersky went downstairs. The lad and the children needed to be able to see when going through the house and to exit as noiselessly as possible. So he had gone downstairs and turned the lights back on and unlocked the door while everyone else was asleep. Gregson nodded gravely. Yes, I believe it does answer all the facts, Mr. Holmes, as always. There is still one thing I cannot figure out. And what is that? Did the telephone call have anything to do with all of this? And if so, what? Of course, it had everything to do with it. In fact, it was one of the points on which the whole thing hinged. Please clear it up for me, Mr. Holmes, said Gregson hopelessly. It is one of the strangest parts about this. Consider this. Would the answer given to the question have been any different depending on who answered the phone? No, there are only 2 logical answers in such a situation. You have a wrong number, or there is no one living here by that name, or mild variations of those. Precisely. Therefore, could anyone listening in on the receiving end of the call be able to determine what the question was? Gregson thought a moment. Yes, I suppose so. There you have it then. said Holmes, as though all had been made clear as day. "What? What have I, Mr. Holmes?" "The reason for the telephone call and the weird laugh given after the response." "I'm afraid I'm still a bit lost, Mr. Holmes." Holmes again turned to me. "Watson, you were in the military. Did you ever use, or were you aware of the use of coded messages?" "Of course," said I. "They were often used when information had to be sent to a specific person, and it had to be kept away from any potential enemies. It was best if the information was disguised in such a way that the enemy was not even aware that any valuable information was being passed at all." "Does that clear things up, Gregson?" asked Holmes, turning to him. "I suppose so, but what was the message?" "That all was in readiness. That someone had left and was waiting outside to collect the children. The caller would have been aware of when the carriage left and would have waited a predetermined amount of time to allow them to arrive." "So you're saying that someone took a carriage of some sort, heading for the Mulaski farm. Those at the party were aware of the departure and the amount of time it would take them to reach the farm, and then called to let the eldest son know, so that he could lead the children downstairs and out of the house?" "That's it exactly," said Holmes, pleased. "The weird laugh came because Mrs. Mulaski had unwittingly played into their hands, though she could hardly have done otherwise. And, as we have just learned, her voice would have been easily heard across the room, and likely from the top of the stairs to the first floor. Unfortunately, Gregson, that is all I can tell you. Given the nature of this entire business, I will be surprised if the son will tell you who his accomplices were, and I doubt if any of them know where the children ended up. I suspect they were out of the country soon after New Year's Day, and may even have ended up back in Poland. At the very least, it would be quite a risk to keep them in Britain. Moreover, I would expect that, in order to prevent detection, the children have been separated." "I must say, Mr. Holmes," said Gregson, shaking his head in amazement, "your understanding of the criminal mind is remarkable. I'm forever grateful that you are on the side of the angels." I nodded my hearty agreement. Gregson thanked Holmes and declared that he was on his way to question the Mulaski's eldest son. We bade him goodbye and walked down the street. "Truly remarkable once again, Holmes," I said admiringly. "Gregson has been working on that for months." He shrugged. "I would say commonplace, but for the fact that it doesn't seem to be. The real mystery to me is how it has been so difficult." We walked a bit further on. "There is still one small point that I don't quite understand," I said thoughtfully, going over the case in my mind. "What is that, Watson?" "It's perfectly clear to me that the son originally claimed to have seen the children in the attic in an attempt to make his parents believe that they had, in fact, been there. Why then did he later admit the truth that he hadn't? It was simply because his parents had made it known that the fire was on the stairs before his father retrieved him from his bedroom, and it therefore would have been impossible for him to have gone up. Merely for the sake of argument, might he not have claimed to have gone up out of guilt for not having actually done all he could to save them? Perhaps, but for the fact that the fire itself would have absolved him. He evidently didn't realize this when fabricating his lie." I chuckled. "As you said, you've answered everything. If only they had realized sooner their need for your assistance, you might have set them on the trail of those who took the children." "Indeed," said Holmes grimly. "I admit that I don't entirely comprehend the facts of this case." "Holmes?" I asked in surprise. "How does a person take his younger siblings from their home in the middle of the night, and on Christmas Eve no less, to deliver them into the hands of strangers, to be taken and raised in an unfamiliar place by unfamiliar people? He took their lives from them, Watson, and took any chance of peace from the Mulaskis. I've deduced the reasons, but not the mental rationale." He shook his head in disbelief at all that had happened. Gregson later informed us that he had questioned the lad. However, as Holmes predicted, he was unwilling to give more information, insisting endlessly that the children had not made it out. Gregson also reported that he had tracked down the lady who had called that night, and she claimed it was legitimately an incorrect number on her part, and that was as close as Gregson or any of the police came to finding the lost children. In spite of his anticipation of this outcome, it left Holmes in a black mood for days afterwards at the thought of all that was done, and how they would likely never be returned to their parents. Thank you for listening.